Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Technology, Media, and Telecom at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be talking about AI, data centers, and energy. And joining me to discuss this are Leika Kawasaki and Dan Thompson, two members of our analyst team. Welcome to the podcast, Leika, for the first time, and welcome back, Dan.
Thanks for having me here, Eric.
It's always great to be back, and you can't see me, but I have my tinfoil hat on this morning, so just in case, I just want to make that clear.
Your tinfoil hat, why? Are we heading into such scary territory, Dan? Well, so I guess actually that the first thing that we should really address is, there's been a lot of discussion about what the energy levels required, and it seems like we're revisiting something that had been a topic of conversation back in the cryptocurrency days and blockchain and a number of other things. But generative AI, and I'll call out generative AI separately from a lot of what. Again, I still stumble at the idea of that we're now in a day and age we've got legacy AI and modern AI and all the back and forth. But clearly, the enthusiasm for generative approaches is fairly huge. And we see that in a lot of our enterprise end user data, right? That really level of demand seems massive. Yeah.
Yeah, and isn't that interesting, really? When exactly what you were just saying, if you rewind the clock even further, at the root of what we're going to talk about is increasing power density per rack inside data centers. We kind of boil this all down. And the topic of increasing densities has been around for at least a decade, right? Everybody's been sort of predicting this. Oh gosh, these rack densities are going to rise. It's going to be crazy. Not going to be able to deal with it. And then finally, now we're actually seeing densities rise as a result of AI, and particularly generative AI. And so, yeah, it's kind of funny that we've been talking about this for forever, but it's now finally happening.
So now suddenly it's here, as the saying goes. Well, and when we first start off with just a little bit of background. So the two of you have been working on a lot of the data side perspectives on this. What are those pieces that we brought together? We've got some data now. We've got a lot of additional research that's going on. What is it that we're doing to pull this together? So some of this is some of our existing data sets. Some of this we're assembling in a bunch of different places. And Leika, you've been doing a lot of work in this area. Can you give us a little background about what you've been working on, and at least what the first order work is done and what's been covered?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, currently we do have a forecast that we have in place, data center market monitor. We do estimate the forecast of data center power demand, right? That said, we are also working to build this AI study, AI impact into data center. And there are many different variables that we are actually looking into building this new study, right? One element would be observing how data center providers are acquiring land, power to build data center, right? And then the other element is actually how fast they can actually get hold of those equipments like generators, right? Another element would be looking at data center chip suppliers. And then the demand is shortage. And then there is the whole liquid cooling part of it. So there is many different elements that we are looking to building this new study of AI impact to data center. And hopefully that will help us build a longer forecast. Currently, we have a forecast view 5 years, and that's actually based on our internal databases that we have, right? Not only for leased data center, but also hyperscale and crypto mining, which we are currently tracking over, I think, 11,000 facilities globally. So I think this coming summer, we're going to have a better view of how the AI impact into infrastructure will be.
So, but this is taking the data center knowledge base, which is that database of data center locations, and then also the hyperscale and crypto mining capabilities that are rolling into there, and looking to make some at least first order estimates on what how much power is out there, how we see power demand growing, and I guess some of those next stage pieces. Dan, this is some work that you've been looking at least early on in terms of power consumption, but we're now starting to get into a very different area in terms of what those demands are, abilities that are generating it. These are suddenly we're in the midst of the wave.
Yeah, and I want to call out a couple of things that Leika said there and maybe draw them to a finer point or say it in a slightly different way just to kind of make sure that we all sort of grasp what it was that she was saying there. So it's one thing to make an announcement that you're going to build a 2 gigawatt data center campus or a number of data centers that will total 2 gigawatts. I'm not using that number to pick on any particular provider. I'm just calling this out. It's another thing to take a step back and ask the question, okay, fair enough, 2 gigawatts, but across what time frame? And is it even possible, given supply chain issues and things like this, to build out such a thing in the time frame that you've proposed? And so the intelligence and the education that we're trying to bring to this forecast is exactly what Lake had just described, which is to say, not only are we taking into account what the data center providers and the developers are announcing, but we're also asking the question from the equipment providers of could you even build that out? And like, what is your current pipeline for building? And then looking at the chip manufacturers and saying, well, when are they going to deliver these chips, which are the things that are going to be consuming the energy? And then even talking to the power companies and our own internal power teams to say, is there infrastructure in the places that these have been proposed to even do this? It's an important thing to consider all of these just to kind of help temper some of this. So, like, it's not, like 2 gigawatts is not a next year thing, right? Like, this is a much longer horizon that we're talking about. And to that point of what you were just saying there, Eric, I think like this has sort of the recent year, the last 12 to 18 months or so of developments, particularly from the hyperscalers, which has sort of flowed downstream to the data center providers and developers, is one of the things that we realize is that a 5 year forecast, like that's not even that forecast anymore. Like that's just pipeline. Like if we look at the data centers that have been proposed, the ones that we know about, the ones that we know are currently under construction, I mean, we can easily get to 2031 and we're still just working through announcements. So that to me is not even like that's a pipeline, as I said. That's not even a forecast. And so the point that Leica was making there is we have to get better at what we're doing, which is to forecast out much further so that it's a true forecast. This is helpful, of course, to the power companies as they're doing their forecasting. This is helpful to investors just to sort of know what the assets that they're investing in would potentially be competing with, where, thoughts are about putting these things. And then just as a conversation, at the national level, or this is not necessarily restricted to the United States, but as we look globally, from a policy perspective, is it okay that data centers are consuming a huge portion of the energy that's being created, or do we need to take a step back and say, actually, for our economy and our, situation in our country, we want to put a focus on something else. And so all this data is supportive of that and then can help drive those conversations. We believe, anyway, it can help drive those conversations.
Well, you raise a really interesting point here, which is the fact that this is infrastructure that takes a long time to build. And so when we're talking about a 5-year projection, this is something, that differentiation between what's a pipeline and what's a forecast, that 5 years, this is what, there's already been commitment to build. And those are things that we can actually put our fingers on and identify that here's the commitment. We can figure out, what that pipeline development looks like, what the how long is it going to take all the pieces to actually be available to build that much capacity? Interesting to see that thought going even further out. I guess this is an environment in which those sorts of timelines are really critical. And I guess it's somewhere the methodology also is a key part of this as well. And like you were mentioning the fact that this is a bottom up study. I mean, we've seen a lot of top down, if all of the potential gets built out, here's these crazy numbers. But there's a fundamental fact of how this actually got, how we're working at this, which is starting from how many data centers are out there and those pieces. And you speak a little about what that means and what some of those impacts are.
Yeah, we are tracking from the bottom-up approach, but we also looking at the chips, right? The chip manufacturers, how many chips will be shipped, where those will be landing, right? Is it going to be at a hyperscale facility? That said, we do believe that the AI in general will also benefit not only the hyperscalers, but also the lease data center providers, right? Because lease data center providers do lease their facilities to the hyperscalers and cloud service providers, right? It is still a question mark in terms of how many chips and how fast it will be distributed across the board, right? We are definitely seeing something similar happening to the cloud growth that happened many years ago, right? We do believe that the AI infrastructure will start within the US, right? And then spread across the globe. I mean, we are still in early stages of studying this impact overall. That said, we do have great, database that we can rely on. We do have insights from analysts, right? We do go through a lot of documents, city documents, and news articles. There's many different things that we can put into this model forecast further, including the energy group that we have within the S&P. Outside of that, one thing to mention about the supply chain, right? I think I was just talking with Kelly the other day. She was mentioning that in the US is about 70 months waiting period for generators, right? Up from, I think, 54 months a year ago and 6 months pre-pandemic. So supply chain has been a big issue, right? So that's something to consider when we're doing the forecast.
Oh, wow. It's getting back to Dan's point about pipeline, and that's,
Right,
you're talking about Kelly Morgan, who heads up our data center team. It's interesting to see that those sorts of lead times, that you're seeing that sort of growth in the sort of lead times. But those are lead times for generators. I think it's well known that there are lots of GPU shortages, and that's clearly a key part of it.
right.
But you need generators to give you the backup capacity to actually build the facilities to house all that GPU capacity.
Correct. And then there is the lead time for transformers, switch gears, and so on, right? To Dan's point, I think it would be interesting to see this space in terms of how supply chain can keep up with the demand, right? We've seen a lot of demand for enterprises saying that they are going to be adopting AI, ML workloads, but we will see how that would match with the supply side.
And one of the other things that you've also been looking at, alternative data center sites. We talked in the past about the idea of the AI data center, and I think we'd kind of come to this idea that, well, maybe that sort of specialization was fairly nichey, but especially with the shortage of GPUs, this really seems to be something that's starting to come into its own.
I think there are developments yet to be seen here. So I think, in speaking of the AI data center specifically, there are a handful of data centers around the country today that we would say are 100% dedicated to AI. There are yet more still coming out of the ground as we speak. But I think, to a large degree, what we're believing or what we're seeing is probably end up in some sort of a hybrid state between now and we're not sure. Which is to say that some of the data center will be dedicated to AI type equipment, or let me just say GPU based compute, just to make this a little bit more broad. And then some of the data center will be dedicated to, traditional CPU based compute. And as we've talked to the various data center providers, they're designing data centers with this exact thing in mind. So they can deploy liquid cooling to part of the floor. They can deploy liquid cooling to the entire floor, and they can mix. So you can have liquid cooling and air cooling. If you look at what is being deployed what is being released by NVIDIA, at least for the foreseeable future, it will be both air and liquid cool. And so there's, that kind of further underscores this whole question of, like, how do we build data centers? What should they look like? Not from an exterior perspective, but, from an internal guts perspective. And then, back to the supply chain thing, is there anybody manufacturing the liquid cooling gear at scale enough to satisfy all of these chips that NVIDIA will produce? These are all valid questions. It's just sort of a bit of inside baseball, like when the analysts are sort of huddling around the table and kind of going over these numbers. It's a very common thing to hear, which is the statement, I think this number is right. I'm just not sure if the time horizon is right. So the number, I think we'll hit the number, whatever the number may be. It's just a question of, is it 3 years from now? Is it 7 years from now? Is it 10 years from now? Like, that's the fun part, really, of this job, is sort of like making guesses at, which is essentially what we're paid to do, is make guesses at, when is this going to happen? I think there's probably a fair amount of news right now that should be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, but also just knowing that, we are seeing something new and different, which to bring the conversation back around to the forecasting that we were talking about a minute ago, leveraging both a bottoms up approach and a top down approach we believe anyway, is a wise way to approach this because, just doing bottoms up, you're sort of left with history defines our future. And I think we're in a place now where we can see that something new is happening. So this generative AI push or CPU based compute push is a net new. So that will very definitely change what this looks like in the future. So we need some sort of vision as to what that's going to look like. Which can't be looking back. It needs to be forward looking. So I think that kind of underscores the importance of using both of these methodologies to create these forecasts. But this net newness, I think, is kind of what we're all excited about, right? Is how much power will that consume? Are we talking about eventually 60% of the United States energy is consumed in data centers? Are we talking like 7? Like which is it?
Well, but this is also something like you've been working on in terms of both understanding what that power profile looks like and what are the energy implications for all this.
Right. So currently looking at the pipeline, the history trend growth, we do estimate that about 3.1% of global data center power demand accounts for about 3.1% of the total power demand, right, globally. That said, there are countries where the average is much higher, right? Like Ireland, Singapore, Iceland, even within the US, we do believe that about 8% of the country's total power demand comes from data center. We do have currently estimated that between 2024 and 2028, globally is estimated about an addition of 92 gigawatts of data center power. So that's based on our bottom-up approach, looking at facility level information, pipeline, and then the history growth, right? So once we finish this AI study, I do believe that this number will be much higher, like Dan was mentioning. But yeah,
That
very interesting.
92 gigawatts is scary enough.
Yeah, that's basically in North America. Basically, we are saying that it's going to double in the next 40 years, right? So it's interesting. It will be interesting to see how AI, once we finish this study, how AI will add more to that capacity.
There's an interesting point also here to be made, and I think that gets lost when we talk about global or even national numbers. When you continue to zoom this down into community levels, these numbers get really interesting, actually. So if you look at Dominion Energy, if you just look at their numbers, so this is not even like necessarily taking into account our numbers, but if you look at Dominion Energy's numbers for Northern Virginia, they're saying it's more like 40% of the power in that particular energy grid is being dedicated to data centers. So some of these massive power draws, if we spread them across the entire country, it doesn't sound like maybe all that much, like we're talking single digits here. But then when you zoom into the actual communities where these data centers are being built, it's a substantial number.
Well, especially when you get the concentration that you get in Northern Virginia. I mean, it's something that you've commented on before, right? This is the Virginia paradox, yeah?
Exactly. So that's where, you hear it's good to temper these national numbers with sort of these local focal points because you hear these power companies sort of freaking out and, like they're all adjusting their forecasts. And if you're hearing 8% or 3% even, you're like, oh, well, what's the big deal? Like 3% growth, like you should be able to account for 3%, right? But when you zoom into these specific communities, that's when it starts to be challenging. And like, I think at the same time, like, there's an interesting sort of side story to all this, which is data centers are starting to pop up all sorts of places. And it's really become a game of just build it where you can find power. And then we'll worry about the connectivity later and we'll worry about, what workloads happen to run there. There was an interesting announcement recently to kind of underscore this. One of the hyperscalers was going to invest over $1 billion in Mississippi for the development of data centers. And Mississippi has never popped up on anybody's radar in terms of data center development, but now it's interesting. We're also hearing data center development proposals in Cheyenne. We're hearing data center proposals in North Dakota. Again, like no one's ever talked about building data centers in these places to this point because it's not near any population centers. But what it is near is available power. And so that kind of changes the story a bit and makes this interesting, I think.
So you've got grid capacity that's starting to be the driving factor of where data centers get sited. And I guess especially as we start looking at the potential fungibility, if the real restraint or constraint that we're working against is the computational power that we've got. And it's not the interconnect, because so much of what we've done typically has been focusing on getting data centers close to the end users. If we can ship some of this stuff out to places where there are power and get the work done there, maybe that's an alternative, but it's a big balancing act.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think as we transition, if you talk to Nick Patience and some of the folks on our artificial intelligence team and some of the infrastructure folks, they're all talking about this future transition to inference workloads, sort of taking all the power or the net power instead of training, which is sort of where we are today, the training model. And it seems as though there's a bit of a shell game afoot, or will be anyway, into moving infrastructure that's for training to these spots like a Mississippi or like a North Dakota or a Cheyenne, Wyoming, where there was power available, but it's not necessarily near a population center, so that we can then refactor these data centers, which are close to the people, for inference type workloads. At least at early stages to kind of call this out, but it at least seems logical that that's what's happening here. And so you may see some of these facilities being repurposed. It may not be obvious because this could be all the way down at the workload level, that workloads are just being shifted into different parts of the country. But it's kind of this fascinating thing. We have two distinct workload types, which need two distinctly different things in terms of power demand, in terms of latency to people. And so there's this opportunity that it has created for, a Mississippi or North Dakota or whatever, like what we were saying. And so, yeah, I think that what the future holds for AI can mean radically different things for what we do in terms of data center development. And again, I think this is kind of what makes this whole question interesting is, could you propose a data center in North Dakota 6 years ago? No. Could you do it today? Yes, absolutely. Let's have that conversation. It's like, it's just,
Wow.
yeah.
Living in different times. Well, is this the sort of disruption that organizations should be planning for? I mean, what should they be thinking about in terms of looking ahead? Is it primarily focusing on power availability? Are these things that they should be considering what that workload mix looks like? What's the future hold?
That's a great question, and I think it comes down to who is the organization that we're talking about. If it's a power company and you've got available power sitting on your grids, I'd be talking about that because I'm certain that there are folks now who would be interested in that who perhaps weren't previously. Same thing for land developers and landowners. If you've got a piece of property that's got power already supplied to it, like a former manufacturing facility or some former, some other thing that I can't think of off the top of my head that would use a lot of power, there may be a new market for that today that was not existent, just 4 years ago, like what we were talking about. And so that is a very different conversation than if I'm speaking to enterprises who are thinking, I want to do this, I want to get involved in AI. How do I participate and where should my development be? Today, the conversation is, well, good luck getting a hold of a GPU in a cloud because these things there's a lot of contention for these things today. And so you may just have to take it wherever you can get it. If you can find some, H100 servers or A100 servers from NVIDIA, great, buy them up, put them in your data centers. Hopefully you've got the power and cooling situation to be able to take care of them. If you can't find those, maybe you're, taking advantage of some of these new cloud service providers that specialize in GPU-based compute. And maybe that's not necessarily where you want them to be long term, but I want to get out in front of this. I want to be sort of a leader in this. Then that's kind of the what you have to do. If you're an enterprise,
There's a grab for resources.
that's exactly, yeah. I mean, that's the story of the day. Like if you're an enterprise though that tends to sort of take a wait and see approach. Well, now this is a totally different conversation as well, because maybe you just want to wait and let this kind of all fall out, see where we all land in terms of AI. And then maybe I'll participate in a couple of years and just keep on with business as usual, which, that may be a fair approach. There will be some people that kind of scoff at that and say, if you're not using AI, you're going to get left behind. I'm not convinced. There's been plenty of cases in the past where that was not the case. But if we look back to the Industrial Revolution, there were obviously companies that got left behind. So it could be the case, but maybe not. We'll see.
And certainly a point for speculation. But Leika, is this something where supply chain concerns are going to be more of a driver of, or more of a holdback in this? So what do you see as the future of holding?
Future holding. Yeah, I think supply would be a big issue, but yeah, a lot of inference could be done at the edge as well, right? So we also have to look at that aspect that it might not be within a data center that all this compute will be happening, right? It might be outside of data center. So it's wait to see. Yeah.
Well, that the point that, hey, we'll see where inference is headed. The other thing we've also seen is this uptick in handset capabilities. We're now getting, phones that have got greater and greater capacity, that actually have got some level of either neural net processing, tensor devices. Take your pick. It seems like most handset manufacturers are starting to put a little more compute power in there. To your point, maybe we start seeing inferencing being done on a much more distributed basis that changes the energy dynamic yet again. But
Yeah, I mean that's actually
Right.
a great point, and I think as we're all considering this and thinking, what could the overall power demand be, and where will it be? There is a use case in the very very close past. I probably didn't say that right, but that happened that disrupted sort of what people were thinking. And let me explain this. So if you rewind the clock just about 2 years ago, people were projecting and suggesting that smart cars were going to revolutionize data centers. We were going to need container data centers everywhere on every street corner. Like self-driving cars would mandate that there are containerized data centers everywhere. And then what happened? Well, Tesla and others put all the compute in the cars instead of in near data centers. Now, some of this is still being proposed, but a lot of that processing now happens on the cars and not in data centers. And so what Leika just said and what you were just commenting on, that very could well happen. I mean, we've seen this just happen. So as we move towards an inference workload, I mean, who knows where this thing could end up? And that could radically change the way we think about this. There's also advancements in compute efficiency, programming efficiency. Tomorrow somebody could come up with a totally new way of thinking about this, drastically reduces the amount of power. There's just so many unknowns and so many things that we can point to where there have been efficiency gains, but then also, there's points in the technology path where there never were efficiency gains, or efficiency gains were sort of lost, in terms of power demand, just because people just were hungry new things. And so there was never a net. So lots of things to consider as we look to the future.
well, I think the one certainty is that we are once again with generative AI in uncharted waters, and that there's a lot to consider when we move forward. A lot more that we could potentially discuss, but unfortunately, we are at time for this episode. Thank you both. This has been great.
Yeah, absolutely. Always a pleasure to be on, Eric. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having.
And that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us, and thanks to our production team, including Carolyn Wright, Sophie Carr, and Kate Asplund on the marketing and events teams, and our agency partner, the 199. Join us for our next episode, where we're going to be kicking off June and Pride Month with a discussion of language analysis. I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.